My name is Vera Blackwood. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in environments where composure is mistaken for compliance, and quiet observation is mistaken for weakness. I've been a professional, a coworker, a listener, and often the person people assume will simply be fine, no matter what is placed on her shoulders. People usually describe me as calm, organized, reliable, the kind of woman who doesn't rock the boat. What they often mean, though they don't say it out loud, is that I don't demand attention. I don't raise my voice in meetings. I don't perform outrage. I let others finish speaking. I take notes. I remember details. And because of that, I'm frequently underestimated. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about a dramatic takedown or a public humiliation. There are no villains twirling mustaches, no sudden miracles, no explosive confrontations. What I'm sharing with you is quieter than that. Slower. More uncomfortable in its honesty. It's the story of a workplace where my coworkers placed bets on how long I'd last, and how I didn't find out through gossip or confrontation. I heard about it from the intern. Not in a shocking whisper. Not as a scandal. Just a small, awkward truth that slipped out because someone young hadn't yet learned what adults carefully hide. This is a story about being underestimated so thoroughly that people forget you are paying attention. Over the course of this video, I'll walk you through what it feels like to slowly realize the role others have assigned you without your consent. How subtle disrespect can become normalized when it's wrapped in smiles and professionalism. How silence can begin as self-protection and later transform into something far more deliberate. You won't hear me claim moral superiority. I made compromises. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. I told myself stories to survive, and when things finally changed, they didn't change because I shouted louder or demanded justice. They changed because I stopped being careless with my own power. What unfolded afterward wasn't dramatic on the surface. No one clapped. No one immediately understood what was happening, but consequences arrived all the same, softly, steadily, and without the option to reverse them. I'm telling this story now because I know there are people listening who have been labeled easy, low maintenance, or lucky to be here, simply because they don't perform dominance the way others expect. If that's you, this isn't a fantasy of retaliation. It's a documentary-style account of psychological reversal. How quiet people are often the last ones others truly see. I won't exaggerate. I won't sensationalize. I'll just tell you exactly what happened, in the order it happened, and let you decide what it means. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever realized too late that people were far more comfortable underestimating you than understanding you? To my coworkers, I was easy. That's the word I would have used if you'd asked them. Easy to work with. Easy to assign things to. Easy to overlook without consequence. I wasn't the youngest person in the office, and I wasn't the newest, but I occupied a strange middle space where people assumed I would simply adapt, absorb, adjust. In meetings, I sat slightly off to the side, not because anyone told me to, but because the center seats were always taken quickly by louder personalities. I spoke when asked. I clarified when something didn't make sense. I followed up afterward with clean summaries and action points that made everyone else look organized. Over time, that became my function. I was the one managers trusted to handle it, the one colleague relied on to fix small mistakes quietly before they became visible, the one who stayed calm when deadlines shifted or expectations changed without warning. If someone forgot to loop a stakeholder in, I was asked to smooth it over. If a process broke, I was expected to repair it without complaint. What I didn't realize, at least not at first, was that this reliability slowly erased my complexity in their eyes. I wasn't seen as ambitious. I wasn't seen as someone who might leave. I certainly wasn't seen as someone with limits. I became a constant, like the office lights or the shared calendar system. Useful, necessary, and therefore invisible. No one was cruel to me outright. That's important to say. There were no raised voices, no explicit insults. Everything happened in tones of friendliness and professionalism. Compliments that sounded kind but landed strangely. "You're so low maintenance, Vera. You're always so understanding. I don't know how you stay so calm. I'd be furious." At the time, I took those as praise. I told myself that being steady was a strength, that not needing validation meant I was mature, that visibility was overrated. And in fairness, part of me believed it. I liked my work. I liked doing things well. I liked knowing how the entire machine functioned, even if my name wasn't attached to its success. But perception has a way of solidifying when it goes unchallenged. When new hires joined, I was introduced not by my title, but by my usefulness. If you have questions, ask Vera. She knows how everything works. I became the translator of unspoken rules, the keeper of institutional memory. And slowly, subtly, my role shifted from contributor to support structure. I noticed it in small ways. Projects I helped design were later presented without my name. Decisions I influenced were described as group consensus. Promotions were discussed around me, not with me. When workloads increased, mine did too, quietly, efficiently, without negotiation. Still, I didn't protest. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't yet see a clear line between generosity and erasure. I believed that if I continued to show up with integrity, things would balance out on their own. What I didn't know was that while I was measuring my value by effort and consistency, others were measuring it by how little resistance I offered. To them, I was the person who wouldn't make things difficult, the one who wouldn't escalate, the one who wouldn't leave abruptly and force them to adapt. I was predictable in the way furniture is predictable, always there, doing its job, never demanding acknowledgement. And that perception became the foundation for everything that followed. At that stage, I didn't feel wronged. I felt settled, useful, slightly tired, but proud of my resilience. If someone had told me then that people were already speculating about my limits, my breaking point, how long I'd tolerate the imbalance, I would have laughed. Because at that moment, I truly believed they saw me as I saw myself, capable, steady, and choosing silence as a form of strength. I didn't yet understand how dangerous it is when others mistake your restraint for a lack of options. The first moment didn't announce itself as important. There was no dramatic pause, no shift in the room, no expression on anyone's face that suggested a line had been crossed. If I hadn't been paying attention, if I hadn't already been quietly cataloging how things worked, I might have missed it entirely. It happened during a project update meeting on a Wednesday morning. One of those meetings where everyone pretends it will take 15 minutes, and it never does. I had spent the previous 2 weeks coordinating between departments, smoothing timelines, documenting risks, and proposing a workaround that prevented a delay no one else had noticed yet. When the discussion reached that point, I spoke up, calmly, precisely. I explained the issue and the solution in less than a minute. There was a pause. Then my manager nodded and said, "Right, so we'll go with that approach." He didn't say my name. That alone wasn't unusual. Names are often skipped in meetings. But what followed was, a colleague, someone more vocal, more visible, repeated my idea almost word for word, adding nothing new. This time, the response was immediate. "Yes," my manager said, smiling. "Exactly. That's a smart way to handle it." The room moved on. No one looked at me. No one corrected the attribution. No one noticed the duplication. The intern, sitting 2 seats down, glanced at me briefly, as if checking whether I planned to say something. I didn't. I told myself it didn't matter. That was the first rationalization. It's about the outcome, not the credit. We're a team. This isn't ego-driven work. I'd told myself those things before, and they had always felt true. But this time, something lodged itself quietly in my chest. Not anger, not even disappointment, just awareness. I became acutely conscious of how easily my contribution had been absorbed into the room and reassigned. How smoothly it happened. How no one hesitated. It was as if my words had entered a neutral processing zone, stripped of ownership the moment they left my mouth. After the meeting, my manager stopped by my desk. "Good catch on that risk," he said casually. "Thanks for flagging it." It was meant kindly, and yet it confirmed something I hadn't wanted to name. Privately acknowledged, publicly invisible. I smiled. I said, "Of course," and I went back to my work. The rest of the day passed normally. Emails, tasks, small conversations by the coffee machine. No one acted differently. No one treated me poorly, which made it harder to justify the feeling that lingered. That evening I opened my notebook, the slim black one I carried everywhere, and wrote a single line. Idea presented to reassign to unnoticed. I didn't know why I wrote it down. I just knew I didn't want to forget it. In the days that followed, nothing obvious changed, but my attention sharpened. I started noticing patterns I had previously dismissed as coincidences. How often was my input reframed by others? How frequently I was asked to prepare, organize, or fix, but rarely to lead. How credit flowed upward and outward, never sideways. What struck me most was how everyone else seemed genuinely unaware. There was no malice, no conspiracy, just momentum. A system that rewarded visibility and assumed silence meant consent. I tested something small. In the next meeting, I waited. I didn't offer the solution immediately. I let the conversation circle. Within minutes, someone else proposed a less effective version of what I had already prepared. It was accepted without scrutiny. The project took a small hit because of it. Nothing catastrophic, just inefficient. No one connected it to my silence. That's when I understood something unsettling. My contributions were valued, but my presence was not. They wanted the output, not the person behind it. And because I had never challenged that dynamic, it had settled into place comfortably. The first small cut wasn't about credit. It was about realization. Realizing that the room functioned just as easily without acknowledging me as it did with my work. That my silence wasn't being interpreted as generosity, it was being interpreted as absence. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't withdraw. I didn't change my behavior outwardly at all. But internally, something shifted. I stopped assuming that fairness was automatic. I stopped believing that effort alone would recalibrate perception. And I began to understand that being ignored isn't always accidental. It's often the result of being consistently inconvenient. That awareness didn't hurt loudly, it hurt quietly. And unlike louder wounds, it didn't heal on its own. Once you notice a pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. What had once felt like isolated moments began arranging themselves into something more deliberate. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because repetition creates its own logic. The workplace didn't wake up one morning and decide to dismiss me. It simply continued doing what it had learned I would tolerate, and I tolerated a lot. It started with small assumptions, that I would take notes, even when it wasn't my project, that I would stay late if something ran over, that I would absorb last-minute changes without comment. None of it was framed as disrespect. It was framed as trust. "You're just so good at this," someone would say, sliding a task my way. I nodded, I smiled, I delivered. And each time I did, the boundary moved slightly farther away. I told myself I was choosing professionalism over conflict, that I didn't need to correct every misstep, that pointing things out would make me seem difficult, or worse, emotional. I had watched what happened to women in the office who pushed back too visibly. They were described as intense, complicated, not quite team players. So I stayed reasonable. When meetings were scheduled without checking my availability, I rearranged my calendar. When timelines were compressed without consultation, I worked faster. When decisions were announced that affected my workload, I adapted quietly. It wasn't that I didn't feel the strain. I did. I felt it in the way my shoulders stayed tense long after work ended. In the way I reread emails at night, not because they were urgent, but because I couldn't fully disengage. In the way I began to measure my value by how indispensable I could make myself. That, I realize now, was the trap. The more indispensable I became, the less replaceable my labor seemed, and paradoxically, the more replaceable I appeared. They didn't imagine the system without my output, but they rarely imagined me as someone with leverage. There were moments when the disrespect surfaced just enough to be visible, but not enough to be actionable. A joke about how I'd never leave. A comment about how I was basically part of the furniture. A casual remark during drinks about how I held everything together behind the scenes. People laughed when they said these things. I laughed too, sometimes, because challenging them would require admitting that they hurt. And I wasn't ready to do that, not out loud. Instead, I normalized it. I told myself this was simply how organizations worked, that someone always did the invisible labor, that being trusted meant being leaned on. That recognition was fleeting and unreliable anyway. But normalization has a cost. Each time I swallowed a moment that didn't sit right, I trained others how to treat me. I reinforced the idea that my time was flexible, my energy renewable, my boundaries negotiable. I became the solution to problems I hadn't created, and the buffer for tensions no one else wanted to manage. And slowly I stopped being consulted altogether. Decisions that affected my workload were made in rooms I wasn't invited into. Outcomes were presented as final, not open for discussion. When I asked clarifying questions, they were framed as afterthoughts, details to be handled, not perspectives to be considered. Still, I stayed. Part of that was practical. I had responsibilities. Stability mattered. Walking away without a plan felt reckless. But another part of it was psychological. I had invested so much in being the calm one, the reliable one, the reasonable one, that challenging the status quo felt like betraying my own identity. Who would I be if I weren't the person who made things easier for everyone else? So I reframed the discomfort as maturity. I told myself I was above office politics, that I didn't need applause, that my work spoke for itself. These beliefs weren't entirely false, but they were incomplete. They ignored the reality that systems reward visibility, not virtue. And while I was busy being patient, others were busy being seen. The turning point in this phase wasn't a single incident. It was a slow accumulation. A realization that the discomfort I felt wasn't temporary, and it wasn't accidental. It was structural, and it was being sustained by my silence as much as by anyone else's behavior. I began to understand that disrespect doesn't always arrive as an insult. Sometimes it arrives as an expectation, as an assumption, as the quiet confidence that you will continue to give without asking for anything in return. By the time I acknowledged that truth, the role I was playing had already been written for me. I just hadn't read the script yet. Every system assigns roles, whether it admits to it or not. By the time I became fully aware of mine, it had already been in place for years, reinforced by habit, convenience, and my own cooperation. I wasn't asked if I wanted it. I wasn't told explicitly. I was simply used in a way that felt flattering enough to accept and subtle enough to ignore. I was the reliable one, not the leader, not the visionary, not the person whose absence would trigger panic. I was the stabilizer, the person who absorbed uncertainty so others could move quickly and confidently. My job was to make things smoother, quieter, and less visible. Once I saw it clearly, I noticed how consistently that role shaped interactions. When a project needed rescuing, it landed on my desk. When a deadline slipped, I was asked to help catch things up. When a new process needed documenting, I was the one trusted to do it properly. These were not insults. They were endorsements of competence. But competence without authority is a cage. I wasn't invited to early strategy discussions where decisions were actually formed. I was brought in after to execute and refine. My insights were welcomed as long as they didn't disrupt direction. When they did, they were acknowledged politely, and then set aside. I remember a moment when a senior colleague said, "We'll have Vera sanity check this." Sanity check. as if my role was to ensure nothing went wrong, not to shape what should go right. I smiled when he said it. Everyone did. It sounded reasonable, helpful, but it landed heavily, because it confirmed that I was seen as a safeguard, not a stakeholder. What made it harder to challenge was that I was good at the role. I liked the order. I liked clarity. I liked seeing systems work. And I had a natural ability to anticipate problems before they surfaced. That made me valuable, but it also made me predictable. People assumed I would always be there to catch what fell through the cracks. They didn't ask if I wanted to keep doing that forever. I started noticing how my time was discussed when I wasn't in the room. Phrases like, "Vera can handle it," or "let's just run it by Vera," floated through conversations as if my availability were a given. No one asked me directly. They just assumed alignment. And because I rarely objected, the assumption hardened into fact. The role extended beyond tasks. It shaped expectations of my personality. I was expected to be calm, neutral, understanding. If I expressed frustration, even mildly, it surprised people. If I pushed back, it was treated as an anomaly, something to be smoothed over rather than addressed. Once, after I questioned a timeline that was clearly unrealistic, a colleague pulled me aside and said, "You're usually so easygoing. Is everything okay?" That question stayed with me, not because it was unkind, but because it revealed how narrowly I was perceived. My value was tied not just to what I did, but to how little discomfort I caused while doing it. I realized then that my role wasn't just operational, it was emotional. I was expected to regulate the atmosphere, to absorb stress so others didn't have to remain steady no matter how much weight was placed on me. And the moment I deviated from that expectation, it registered as a problem. What troubled me most was that I had helped create this version of myself. I had taught them how to treat me by consistently prioritizing harmony over honesty. I had mistaken being agreeable for being respected. That realization wasn't accompanied by anger. It was accompanied by clarity. I saw that if nothing changed, this role would follow me indefinitely. Not just in this job, but in any environment where I defaulted to being useful instead of visible. I would always be the person others relied on, but rarely invested in. The role I was assigned wasn't malicious. It was efficient. And efficiency, once established, is hard to disrupt. But disruption was coming, not in the way anyone expected. Because the moment I recognized the role, I also recognized something else. Roles only persist when someone continues to play them. The day everything shifted didn't arrive with confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voice, no dramatic realization in the middle of a crowded room. It happened on a quiet afternoon, in a moment so small it could have passed unnoticed if I hadn't already been paying attention. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a document I had written but wouldn't be presenting. That part was already decided. A colleague had asked me to clean it up so it would be ready for leadership review. I had done more than that, of course. I had restructured the logic, corrected flawed assumptions, and flagged a risk that could have had legal implications if left unaddressed. I sent it back with notes. Clear, concise, professional. A few minutes later, I received a message. "Thanks, this looks great. We'll take it from here." That was it. No discussion. No follow-up questions. No acknowledgement of the risk I had identified. Just a polite closure. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Not because I was offended, but because something inside me went very still. I realized I no longer felt surprised. That was the shift. Not anger. Resignation had already passed. Not hurt. I had felt that earlier. What settled in its place was a kind of emotional detachment, as if a fog had lifted and left behind a clear, unobstructed view. I leaned back in my chair and asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. What am I actually protecting by staying quiet? The answer wasn't the team. They were doing fine. It wasn't the work. The work would continue with or without me. It wasn't even stability, not really. Stability that required self-erasure wasn't sustainable. It was just familiar. What I was protecting was an image. The image of myself as agreeable, dependable, and uncomplicated. And in protecting that image, I was sacrificing something more important: agency. I closed my laptop and took a walk around the building. No phone, no music, just movement. I needed space to think without productivity attached to it. As I walked, I replayed moments from the past year. Not the obvious slights, but the subtle ones. The times my input had been filtered through someone else's voice. The decisions were made without me. The expectations were placed on me without consent. For the first time, I didn't try to explain them away. I didn't ask whether I was being too sensitive. I didn't search for charitable interpretations. I simply observed the pattern as it was, and what I saw was this. I had been operating as if my value was conditionally dependent on my willingness to accommodate, absorb, and adapt. I had been generous with my labor and frugal with my presence. That imbalance was no longer tolerable. The shift wasn't about deciding to fight back. It was about deciding to stop disappearing. When I returned to my desk, nothing looked different. The office hummed along as usual. People typed, phones rang, calendars filled. No one noticed that anything had changed because the change wasn't external. It was internal and precise. I opened my notebook and wrote a new line beneath the earlier entries. Silence is only neutral if it's chosen. That sentence became an anchor. I didn't make any announcements. I didn't set boundaries out loud yet. I didn't correct anyone. I simply began to pay attention to where my energy was going and whether it was being reciprocated. That day marked the end of automatic compliance. Not in a dramatic way, in a deliberate one. I finished my tasks. I responded to messages. I remained polite and composed. But beneath the surface, I had stopped assuming that my role was fixed. I had stopped believing that endurance was the same as strength. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that I didn't need to prove my worth by making myself smaller. The shift wasn't visible yet, but it was irreversible. After that day, my silence changed texture. From the outside, nothing was different. I still spoke calmly. I still met deadlines. I still showed up prepared. But internally, my quiet was no longer automatic. It was intentional. And intention alters everything. Before, my silence had been a reflex, something I reached for to maintain harmony, to avoid friction, to keep things moving. Now, it has become a filter. I started asking myself whether speaking would actually change an outcome, or whether it would simply offer others more material to repackage. That distinction mattered. In meetings, I listened more than I spoke. Not because I felt invisible, but because I was observing how decisions were really made. Who influenced whom? Which opinions landed and which floated past without impact? I noticed how often conclusions were predetermined, and discussion was merely a performance. When I did speak, I was precise. I stopped filling gaps. I stopped offering solutions prematurely. I let silence do some of the work. This unsettled people more than I expected. Colleagues who were used to relying on my immediate input began to fidget when I didn't provide it. Questions hung longer in the air. Assumptions went uncorrected. Small inefficiencies surfaced, not because I caused them, but because I no longer rushed to fix them before anyone noticed. No one accused me of withholding. They didn't have the language for that. Instead, they interpreted my quiet as agreement, or fatigue, or passivity. Weakness. That misinterpretation gave me information. I saw how little my presence had been consciously valued. How quickly people assumed my silence meant consent rather than consideration. And I took note of who noticed the difference and who didn't. There was a particular moment that clarified things further. During a planning session, a manager outlined a process that I knew, from experience, would fail under pressure. In the past, I would have flagged it immediately, offered alternatives, and saved everyone time. This time, I paused. I asked a single question instead. What happens if that dependency isn't met on time? The room went quiet. They discussed it briefly, waved it off, and moved on. I didn't push. I wrote nothing in the chat. I didn't send a follow-up email. 2 weeks later, the dependency failed exactly as I had anticipated. The project stalled. Stress rippled outward. Emergency meetings were called. No one connected it back to me, and that strangely was the point. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I was testing a hypothesis. Does my intervention actually change how I'm perceived? Or does it only increase how much I'm relied upon? The answer was becoming clear. The more I intervened, the more indispensable my labor became, and the more invisible my boundaries were. Silence, when chosen, allowed the system to reveal itself without my interference. I began documenting more carefully, not in a defensive way, but in a factual one. Decisions, timelines, responsibilities. I kept records not to protect myself from blame, but to understand where accountability truly lived. I noticed something else during this phase. When I stopped over-functioning, some people stepped up, others floundered, and a few grew irritated. Not because I was doing less, but because I was no longer compensating for their gaps. That irritation wasn't directed at me openly. It surfaced as confusion, as questions like, "Are you okay?" or "You've been quiet lately." Always framed with concern, always missing the point. I responded kindly, honestly, "I'm fine, just focused." Which was true. My focus had shifted from being helpful to being intentional, from smoothing everything over to understanding what deserved my energy. Silence, I learned, is powerful not because it withholds, but because it observes. And observation gave me something I had been missing: leverage. Not the kind you wield loudly, but the kind that accumulates quietly as you see how systems actually function when you stop propping them up. They still thought my silence meant I didn't mind. They were wrong. It meant I was choosing. What they never noticed was how much I was learning. When you stop rushing to be useful, you gain time. And time, when paired with attention, becomes insight. While others were busy filling space with opinions and urgency, I was quietly mapping the terrain, how decisions flowed, where authority actually lived, and which relationships mattered more than titles suggested. I began to see the organization as a living system rather than a hierarchy on paper. I noticed which external partners reached out to me directly when something felt off, even if they were supposed to go through someone else. I noticed how often leadership relied on documentation I had built years ago, without fully understanding it. I noticed how certain processes worked only because I had designed informal workarounds that were never written down. None of that had been acknowledged explicitly, but it was there. I also noticed something else: how much institutional memory I carried without realizing it. I knew why certain decisions had been made, not just what those decisions were. I remembered past failures that newer managers had never experienced. I understood which risks were theoretical and which were real, because I had lived through them. This wasn't arrogance, it was an accumulation, and it was invisible to anyone who equated influence with volume. I started organizing my knowledge more deliberately, not to hoard it, but to see it clearly. I documented dependencies. I noted where approvals actually came from versus where they were assumed to come from. I tracked which deadlines were flexible and which ones triggered consequences if missed. I didn't share this with anyone. Not yet. What surprised me was how little attention my reduced visibility attracted. People were comfortable as long as things mostly worked. They didn't question why. They didn't ask how. They simply assumed the system was stable. They mistook continuity for independence. During this period, the intern, the same one who had glanced at me during that earlier meeting, started asking me questions. Not about tasks, but about context. Why things were done a certain way. Who to talk to when something stalls. What mattered and what was just noise. I answered carefully, honestly but without overfunctioning. I wanted her to learn, not lean. One afternoon, while we were talking in the break room, she hesitated before saying something. "I hope this isn't weird," she said, "but people really trust you." I smiled. Trust is relative. She looked at me for a moment, then nodded, as if that made sense. What she didn't know was that trust, when unrecognized, becomes leverage. Not the kind you exploit impulsively, but the kind you can choose whether or not to exercise. I continued doing my job well. That part didn't change. What changed was that I stopped compensating for dysfunction. I let emails wait when they weren't my responsibility. I declined meetings that didn't require my presence. I asked clarifying questions before agreeing to additional work. Each of these actions was small, reasonable, hard to object to individually. Together, they created space. In that space, I prepared, not for confrontation, but for clarity. I reviewed my role, my responsibilities, and the informal expectations that had attached themselves to me over time. I compared them. The gap was significant, and that gap represented unpaid labor, unacknowledged influence, and unprotected exposure. I didn't feel resentful about it anymore. I felt curious. What would happen if I stopped bridging that gap automatically? The answer began to emerge slowly. Projects took longer. Communication became messier. People asked more questions, sometimes too late. And instead of stepping in immediately, I waited, not long enough to cause harm, just long enough to make the structure visible. No one connected this shift to me. They couldn't. From their perspective, I was still reliable, still calm, still doing my job. What they never noticed was that I was no longer doing everyone else's. This phase wasn't about withdrawal. It was about recalibration, about understanding where my effort had been masking systemic weaknesses, and how those weaknesses behaved when left exposed. And through all of this, one fact became increasingly clear. I had more leverage than anyone realized. Not because I controlled people, but because I understood the system they depended on. And understanding, when paired with restraint, is a quiet form of dominance. They didn't notice the preparation because they didn't know what preparation looked like without noise. By the time they sensed something was different, the groundwork was already in place. The reveal didn't happen in a meeting. There was no email that made my heart race, no conversation that suddenly reframed everything. It happened alone, late one evening, when the office was nearly empty, and the lights above my desk had dimmed to their nighttime setting. I was reviewing a contract, not because it was my responsibility, but because I had been asked, casually, to make sure nothing looked off. That phrasing alone told me something. When things mattered quietly, they came to me. When they mattered publicly, they went elsewhere. I read slowly, carefully, line by line. And then I saw it. A dependency that had been assumed for years wasn't actually guaranteed. A clause that everyone believed protected us didn't. It relied on informal understanding, not enforceable language. The entire process hinged on relationships, memory, and continuity. Things that lived in people, not documents. Things that lived, largely, in me. I sat back and felt a strange calm settle in. This wasn't triumph. It wasn't panic. It was clarity. For the first time, I could articulate what had previously only been intuitive. The system functioned not because it was well designed, but because it was quietly maintained. And much of that maintenance had never been acknowledged, safeguarded, or distributed. If I left abruptly, there would be confusion, but not collapse. If I stayed and continued as I had, nothing would change. But if I shifted how and where I engaged, the effects would ripple outward in ways no one was prepared for. I didn't act immediately. I closed the document and made a note in my notebook. Just facts. No emotion. No speculation. Over the next few weeks, I confirmed what I had seen. I cross-referenced processes. I reviewed old decisions. I noticed how often people relied on precedent without understanding its origin. How frequently they assumed stability without knowing its source. This wasn't about exploiting a weakness. It was about understanding responsibility. I realized that my role had expanded far beyond its formal description. Not because I was asked to take on more authority, but because I was trusted to quietly absorb risk. And that trust was unprotected. If something went wrong, the accountability would be diffuse. If something went right, the credit would be collective, or redirected. That imbalance mattered. The private reveal wasn't a single fact. It was a convergence of insight, timing, and readiness. I had the knowledge. I had the documentation. I had relationships built on consistency rather than performance. And perhaps most importantly, I had patience. I didn't feel the urge to expose anything. I didn't want recognition in that moment. What I wanted was alignment between my contribution and my position, between my responsibility and my protection. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider options I had previously dismissed as unrealistic. Not impulsive exits or dramatic confrontations, but structured changes. Strategic ones. I thought about what it would look like to stop cushioning the organization from its own assumptions, to let formal systems carry the weight they claimed to bear, to ensure that if my expertise was required, it was acknowledged as such. None of this required hostility. It required boundaries. The reveal stayed private because it needed to. Not everything gains power by being shared. Some things gain power by being understood fully before they're acted upon. I continued showing up as usual, calm, reliable, present. No one suspected that my understanding of the system had crystallized into something else entirely. They didn't know that the question had shifted from, "How do I endure this?" to, "What am I willing to sustain?" And once you ask that question honestly, the answer changes everything. There comes a moment when insight demands choice. Not action, choice. Action can be delayed, refined, or softened. But once you see clearly, you can't unsee. And once you understand your position within a system, you're responsible for how you respond to that understanding. That was where I found myself. I had options, more than I'd ever admitted before. I could continue as I was, armed now with awareness, but still operating within the same constraints. That path promised stability and predictability. It also promised quiet resentment and slow erosion. I knew what that future looked like. I was already living its early stages. I could confront leadership directly, lay everything out, explain the invisible labor, the structural dependencies, and the risks. Ask for recognition, compensation, and authority. That path appealed to my sense of fairness, but it relied on others being willing to see what they had never needed to notice. And I knew enough about the system to doubt that outcome. Or I could choose a third path. One that didn't involve ultimatums or accusations. One that didn't require anyone else to suddenly change their self-image. A path that simply aligned my behavior with reality. That was the irreversible choice. I decided to stop performing beyond my role. Not dramatically, not punitively, just accurately. I would do the job I was hired to do, at the level it was defined. No more invisible scaffolding. No more emotional regulation on behalf of others. No more absorbing risk without authority. This wasn't withdrawal. It was integrity. Making that decision felt strangely calm. There was no rush of adrenaline, no fear, just a sense of internal alignment I hadn't felt in years. I didn't announce it. Decisions like this don't need witnesses. They need consistency. The irreversibility wasn't about consequences. It was about identity. Once I stopped seeing myself as the quiet support structure, I couldn't return to that role without self-betrayal. I knew the system would resist, not out of malice, but out of inertia. Systems always push back when equilibrium shifts. I expected confusion, friction, maybe disappointment. What I didn't expect was how quickly the effects would begin. Within weeks, small things surfaced. Requests that assumed my automatic compliance now require discussion. Tasks that had always landed with me now hovered, waiting for someone to claim them. Questions that once came to me first began circulating aimlessly. People didn't know what to call this yet. They sensed something was different, but they couldn't articulate it. There was no event to point to. No boundary I had explicitly set. Just a subtle absence of compensation. And absence is harder to argue with than refusal. I also made one more decision. Quiet, but significant. I began exploring options outside the organization. Not because I wanted to leave immediately, but because optionality changes posture. When you're no longer trapped by necessity, you negotiate differently, even in silence. I updated my materials, reconnected with old contacts, researched roles that valued institutional insight rather than just execution. I did this discreetly, methodically, without urgency. The decision point wasn't about escape. It was about leverage. For the first time, I wasn't waiting to be chosen, recognized, or validated. I was choosing myself, calmly, without bitterness, and without spectacle. And that choice set everything else in motion. Once the decision was made, everything became quieter. Not outwardly, meetings still happened, emails still arrived, deadlines still loomed, but inside me, the noise had dropped away. There was no longer a debate running in the background about what I should do versus what I felt. My actions and my understanding were finally aligned. I moved carefully, not secretively. There's a difference. Secrecy is driven by fear of discovery. What I was doing was driven by precision. I reviewed my responsibilities in writing, what was explicitly mine, and what had simply accumulated over time. I adjusted my workflow to match that reality. If something fell outside it, I didn't rush to fix it. I asked questions instead, clarifying ones, neutral ones. Who's accountable for this? Has this been approved? What's the priority relative to my current workload? These questions slowed things down just enough to expose assumptions. People were used to momentum being maintained by my quiet intervention. Without it, they had to confront gaps they hadn't realized existed. At the same time, I began formalizing what I could control. I cleaned up documentation, not to make myself indispensable, but to make ownership visible. I ensured records reflected reality rather than convenience. I stopped translating vague directives into workable plans without confirmation. If something was unclear, it stayed unclear until someone clarified it. No one accused me of being unhelpful. I was still delivering, still professional, still composed. But the system was no longer being cushioned. Behind the scenes, I continued preparing my exit options. Interviews were exploratory, not desperate. Conversations were framed around fit, not escape. I paid attention to how people listened when I spoke about process, risk, and long-term stability. Some leaned in. Others drifted. The difference mattered. What surprised me was how empowering it felt to act without needing immediate results. I wasn't trying to force a reckoning. I was allowing one to unfold naturally. In the office, small tensions surfaced. A manager asked why something hadn't been caught earlier. I answered honestly. It wasn't in my scope this time. Another asked if I could just take a quick look at an issue. I replied, I don't have the capacity this week. Who else should we loop in? These weren't refusals. They were redirects. People nodded, adjusted, moved on. But I could sense the discomfort underneath. The unspoken question. Why is this suddenly harder? What they didn't realize was that it had always been this hard. They had just grown accustomed to not feeling it. I kept my demeanor steady. No defensiveness. No explanation beyond what was necessary. Silence again became a tool, not to withhold, but to let reality speak for itself. Externally, I also made one key move. I declined to renew an informal commitment I had maintained with an external partner. One that had never been formalized, but had been quietly relied upon for years. I framed it as a capacity issue, which was true. I offered a proper handoff. Documentation. Context. The response was immediate concern. Who should we go to now, they asked. That depends, I said calmly. Who's formally responsible? There was a pause. That pause told me everything. The consequences hadn't fully arrived yet, but the conditions for them were in place. And because I hadn't announced anything, no one could point to me as the cause. I was simply no longer compensating. Moving in silence isn't about disappearing. It's about letting your absence of overfunctioning reveal the truth of a system. And the truth was beginning to surface. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They emerged the way pressure does in a sealed room, quietly, gradually, until the discomfort could no longer be ignored. At first, it showed up as confusion. Then, it was inconvenient. Then finally, unease. Projects began missing small details. Not catastrophic ones, just enough to slow things down. Deadlines slipped by a day or two. Stakeholders asked questions that no one seemed prepared to answer. Decisions stalled because no one was quite sure who had the authority to make them. These were the kinds of issues I used to intercept before they surfaced. Now they surfaced. What struck me was how quickly the tone shifted. Meetings grew longer. Email threads multiplied. People started CCing more aggressively, as if visibility alone could substitute for clarity. I was pulled into a few of these conversations, not as a fix, but as a reference point. Do you remember how we handled this last time? Didn't we used to have a process for this? You've seen this before, right? I answered truthfully, briefly, without filling in the gaps they hadn't asked about. Yes, we did. There is documentation. That decision was made under different constraints. Each response was accurate. None of them restored the old equilibrium. I could feel the system straining, not because I had taken something away, but because it was now carrying its own weight. There was a moment, about a month into this phase, when a senior manager stopped by my desk. He leaned against the partition, casual but intent. "You've been quieter lately," he said. "Everything okay?" It was the same question I'd heard before, but this time it landed differently. Not as a concern, but as a diagnosis. Something was off, and he was trying to locate it. "I'm focused," I replied. "A lot of moving parts right now." He nodded, unsatisfied but unsure how to proceed. The discomfort spread unevenly. Some people adapted. They clarified roles, took ownership, asked better questions. Others grew frustrated. They missed the ease of having someone else absorb the complexity. And then there were those who felt the loss most acutely without knowing why. One colleague, someone who had often leaned on my quiet support, started making small mistakes. Nothing dramatic, but enough to draw attention. I watched as he struggled to keep up with expectations that had previously been softened by my behind-the-scenes corrections. He didn't blame me. He blamed the workload, the timeline, the system. In a way, he was right. The system had been designed to rely on invisible labor. Now that labor was no longer being freely given, its flaws were exposed. What I found most telling was that no one asked me directly what had changed. They circled the issue, spoke around it, and tried to solve symptoms rather than causes. Because asking would require acknowledging something uncomfortable, that they had been relying on my unrecognized effort for far longer than they realized. As the weeks passed, leadership began to notice patterns, recurring issues, delays that didn't resolve themselves, dependencies that were assumed but undocumented. Task forces were formed, consultants were mentioned, new tools were proposed. All expensive, all reactive. I watched quietly, not with satisfaction but with a strange sense of distance. This wasn't vindication, it was inevitable. The consequences weren't punishment, they were feedback, and the system was finally receiving it. By the time they realized something fundamental had shifted, they were already behind. The early confusion had hardened into concern. Not panic yet, that came later, but a growing awareness that the usual fixes weren't working. More meetings didn't produce clarity. More tools didn't create ownership. More urgency didn't replace understanding. They were trying to repair outcomes without addressing structure. I saw it in the way leadership began asking broader questions, ones that suggested they were sensing depth without yet locating it. Why does this keep coming back? Didn't we already solve this? Where's the breakdown? These questions circulated in rooms I wasn't invited into. I knew that because the answers were often incomplete when they reached me later, filtered through summaries and assumptions. When I was asked directly, it was usually framed as a consultation, not a collaboration. "Can you take a look and tell us what you think?" I did. Carefully. Factually. I pointed to documentation that already existed, to decisions that had been made informally and never formalized, to responsibilities that had been assumed rather than assigned. I spoke without accusation, without emotion, and still the response was always the same: a nod, a pause, then a return to urgency. They were looking for a patch, not a reckoning. At one point, a director suggested we just get through this quarter and then reassess. The implication was clear: stability now, reflection later. But later never comes in systems built on momentum. I realized then that even if I laid everything out, every dependency, every risk, every invisible contribution, it wouldn't land the way it needed to. Not because they were incapable of understanding, but because acknowledging it would require admitting how much had been taken for granted. And that admission was too destabilizing. There was a meeting where the tension finally broke through the surface. A timeline had collapsed. An external partner was frustrated. Leadership was asking how this had happened out of nowhere. I was in the room this time. As the discussion unfolded, I recognized the pattern instantly. This wasn't new. It was a familiar failure mode, one I had prevented multiple times in the past through quiet intervention. Someone turned to me and said, "Vera, you've seen this before. What are we missing?" The room went still. This was the moment they thought they wanted. I took a breath and answered honestly. "We're not missing information," I said. "We're missing ownership." There was a pause, longer this time. I continued calmly. This process has always depended on informal coordination. It worked because certain gaps were being bridged quietly. Those bridges aren't formalized. No one interrupted me. But I could see the discomfort. The recognition, flickering but incomplete. "So what do we do?" someone asked. I looked around the table, at faces that were tired, stressed, searching for a solution that wouldn't require a fundamental shift. "We decide who actually owns this," I said, "and we accept the consequences of that decision." They nodded, took notes, thanked me. And then, predictably, the conversation drifted back to short-term fixes. Afterward, in the hallway, a manager walked beside me. "We really appreciate your perspective," she said. "We should have involved you more earlier." It was meant kindly, but it landed hollow. Because earlier had passed. Too late doesn't always mean irreversible, but it often means costly. And what they were facing now was the cost of years of unexamined reliance. Not on me alone, but on the idea that someone would always quietly make it work. I felt no urge to say, "I told you so." That urge only arises when you need validation. What I felt instead was certainty. The system was trying to fix a problem it hadn't fully named. And without naming it, it would continue cycling through the same failures, just with different tools, different timelines, different people absorbing the strain, including me if I allowed it. I wouldn't. By the time they were ready to truly address what had been happening, I had already moved past the point of waiting for permission. And that, more than anything, is why it was too late to fix it the way they wanted to. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost disappointingly calm. No raised voices, no dramatic revelations, no emotional confessions, just a scheduled meeting, a glass-walled conference room, and 3 people who understood, on some level, that a conversation long avoided could no longer be postponed. It was framed as a check-in. "We want to talk about your role," my manager said, hands folded neatly on the table. "Things have changed." I nodded. They have. That was the extent of the tension. The rest was careful language and measured tone. They spoke first, about evolving needs, about pressure from above, about how my experience and institutional knowledge were becoming increasingly important. There was talk of better alignment and leveraging strengths. I listened without interrupting. When they finished, there was a pause. One of those pauses that signals it's your turn, but no one quite knows what you'll say. "I agree that my role and responsibilities haven't been aligned for some time," I said. "That's been clear for a while." They exchanged glances, not defensive, uncertain. "We didn't realize," my manager began. "I know," I said gently. "That's part of the issue." Silence settled, not heavy but focused. I didn't recount every instance of invisible labor. I didn't list grievances. I didn't dramatize. I simply described the gap between what I was accountable for and what I was expected to absorb. Between my formal authority and my informal responsibility. I spoke in specifics. Processes, dependencies, decisions, not feelings. They listened more carefully this time. One of them asked, "What would alignment look like to you?" It was a reasonable question. One they should have asked years earlier. I answered honestly. Clarity, ownership, and protection. If my expertise is required to manage risk, that needs to be reflected formally. Otherwise, it shouldn't be assumed. There was a long pause. They discussed options, adjustments, possibilities. Nothing concrete yet, but more than I had been offered before. And still, I felt the distance. Not emotional distance, structural. Because even as they spoke, I could sense the limits of what they were willing to change. They wanted relief, stability, a return to smooth operations. What they didn't want was to fully dismantle the assumptions that had made things easy for them in the first place. At the end of the meeting, my manager said something revealing. "We really value you," he said. "We just didn't realize how much you were carrying." I nodded. I understand. And I meant it. Understanding, however, doesn't obligate me to continue. The confrontation ended without resolution. No raised voices, no ultimatums. Just a mutual recognition that something fundamental had shifted, and that not all shifts can be absorbed without loss. When I left the room, I felt calm. Not triumphant, not angry, just clear. They had seen me, finally. But seeing doesn't always lead to change. Sometimes it simply confirms timing. I knew then that whatever happened next wouldn't be driven by resentment or urgency. It would be driven by alignment. And that made all the difference. Who I am now is not dramatically different from who I was then. That's the part people often misunderstand. Growth doesn't always announce itself with transformation. Sometimes it looks like refinement, like subtraction, like the quiet removal of what no longer belongs. I am still calm, still observant, still capable of holding complexity without panic. Those qualities were never the problem. The problem was how I allowed them to be used without limit. Now I understand my own edges. I no longer confuse patience with permission. I no longer assume that being capable obligates me to compensate for what others choose not to see. I still contribute deeply, but only where there is clarity, consent, and accountability. After that conversation, I didn't rush into anything. I didn't resign in protest. I didn't issue demands. I continued doing my work while also continuing conversations elsewhere. Conversations where my experience was met with curiosity rather than convenience. When the right opportunity emerged, it didn't feel like escape. It felt like alignment. In that new environment, I was asked questions before assumptions were made. My insights were brought into rooms early, not retrofitted later. Responsibility came with authority, and trust came with structure. The contrast was quiet, but unmistakable. Looking back, I don't feel bitterness toward my former coworkers. Most of them were operating within a system that rewarded ease and speed over reflection. They didn't wake up intending to erase me. They simply learned what the system taught them, and I had played my part in reinforcing it. What I do feel is a sense of responsibility toward my past self. She believed that endurance was noble, that if she just stayed steady, things would eventually balance. She didn't realize that systems don't self-correct without friction, and that silence, when unexamined, becomes a kind of agreement. Who I am now still values quiet, but I value it as a choice, not a default. I speak when it matters. I stay silent when observation serves better. And I no longer offer my labor as a substitute for structural clarity. There's a difference between being generous and being available without limit. I understand that difference now. The most important shift wasn't external. It was internal. I stopped waiting to be recognized. I started acting as if my presence mattered, because it does. Not in a performative way, not loudly, just firmly. Quiet dominance, I've learned, isn't about control. It's about alignment. About knowing what you bring, what it costs you to bring it, and choosing where that cost is worth paying. I am still the woman who notices what others miss. I just no longer give that gift away indiscriminately, and that has changed everything. There's a temptation, when a story reaches its end, to look for a clear moral, something sharp and easily repeated. A lesson that fits neatly into a sentence and offers closure. Real life doesn't work that way. What I took from this experience isn't a rule about workplaces or coworkers or even respect. It's an understanding about patterns and how quietly they form when no one questions them. My coworkers placed bets on how long I'd last because, from their perspective, I was predictable. Not weak, not incompetent, predictable. I had taught them over time that I would adapt, absorb, and endure. that I wouldn't disrupt their comfort by asking for more than what was offered. And when people grow comfortable, they stop imagining alternatives. The intern told me about the bets, not because she was cruel, but because she hadn't yet learned the unspoken rule. Some truths are only safe when they're hidden behind humor. She didn't understand why it mattered. I didn't explain it to her. What mattered wasn't the bet itself. What mattered was the certainty behind it. That certainty only exists when someone believes you don't have options. Quiet dominance isn't about proving people wrong. It's about removing yourself from the story they've written for you. Not by force, not by spectacle, but by no longer participating in the role that makes their assumptions comfortable. I didn't stay to teach them a lesson. I didn't leave to punish anyone. I simply stopped carrying what wasn't mine to carry. And when I did, the system responded the only way it could, with discomfort, confusion, and eventually, adaptation. Not because I demanded it, but because I was no longer cushioning it from reality. If there's a takeaway here, it's this: being calm, capable, and quiet is not a flaw. But when those traits are offered without boundaries, they become an invitation for others to decide your limits for you. You don't owe visibility to people who benefit from your invisibility. You don't owe endurance to systems that mistake it for consent. And you don't need to explain your departure from a role you never agreed to play. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop being convenient. Not angrily, not loudly, just deliberately. That's where real change begins. Not in confrontation, but in alignment. In choosing where your energy goes and letting the absence of your overfunctioning tell the truth for you. I'll end with this question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized that people were comfortable underestimating you until the day you stopped making it easy for them?
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ